Hello, and welcome back to the Crime Folio. In our exploration of the human psyche's darkest corners, we often find that the most profound tragedies are born not from hate, but from love that has been corrupted. Valentine's Day, a day universally associated with affection and heartfelt gestures. But what happens when that passion sours into obsession and affection twists into a venomous desire for revenge? Today, we delve into a case where the Day of Hearts was irrevocably stained with blood. This is the chilling story of an ex-lover's retribution, the Valentine's Day Massacre. Case 1. The staged home invasion. A devout husband's dark secret is exposed after a Valentine's Day tragedy. Our first story takes us to the quiet, affluent suburbs of Washington Township, Michigan. It is a place of manicured lawns, two-car garages, and families who project an image of idyllic American life. It was here, in a sprawling home on a peaceful cul-de-sac, that Tara and Stephen Grant built their life. To the outside world, they were a portrait of modern success and traditional values. Tara, 34, was the breadwinner, a driven and accomplished operations manager for a construction firm, a woman who traveled the world for business, commanding respect in a male-dominated field. Stephen, 37, was the stay-at-home father to their two young children, a boy and a girl, aged 6 and 4. He was the picture of domestic devotion, the parent who attended school functions, coached sports teams, and maintained the household. He was known in their community as a friendly, devout, and reliable man. This division of roles, however, was a source of a deep, unspoken friction that simmered just beneath the surface of their perfect life. Tara's career was ascending, demanding more of her time, more of her travel. She was confident, independent, and increasingly comfortable in her role as the family's primary provider. Stephen, in turn, felt his own identity diminishing. His own business, a tool and die shop called Grant's Machining, had struggled, forcing him into a role he found emasculating. He was the man left behind, his days dictated by school runs and household chores while his wife conquered boardrooms across the globe. A quiet resentment began to fester, a poisonous weed growing in the garden of their marriage. He saw her ambition not as a shared success, but as a personal slight. He craved control, a sense of authority that he felt had been stripped from him. This simmering conflict found a catalyst in the form of a 19-year-old German au pair, Verena Dirks. Hired to help with the children during Tara's frequent trips, Verena's presence introduced a new, volatile element into the household. For Stephen, she was not just a helper, she was an audience. She was young, impressionable, and present. He confided in her, lamenting his marital frustrations, painting himself as a misunderstood and neglected husband. The line between employer and employee, between confidant and conspirator, quickly blurred. An affair began, a clandestine act of rebellion conducted under the very roof he shared with his wife and children. It was a desperate grasp for the power and validation he felt he had lost. Tara was not oblivious. A woman of sharp intellect and keen intuition, she began to notice the subtle shifts in her home. The hushed conversations that stopped when she entered a room. The unusual charges on credit card statements. The intimate familiarity between her husband and their au pair. Her suspicion solidified when, during a business trip to Puerto Rico, she used a quiet moment to check their shared phone records online. The screen in front of her confirmed her worst fears. Hundreds of calls and text messages exchanged between Stephen and Verena, often late at night, filled with a familiarity that went far beyond professional courtesy. The betrayal was absolute, a clean, sharp cut to the heart. Upon her return to Michigan on February 9, 2007, the atmosphere in the Grant home was thick with unspoken accusations. The confrontation that had been brewing for months was now inevitable. Valentine's Day was just 5 days away, a cruel, looming reminder of a love that was now a lie. Tara was resolute. She had discovered the full extent of the affair, including romantic getaways Stephen had taken with Verena while she was away on business. She told Stephen she was leaving him and taking the children. She was done. The life he knew, the comfortable existence financed by her success, was about to be dismantled. For Stephen, this was not just the end of a marriage, it was the ultimate loss of control. He was facing a future where he had no thingno wife, no home, and a diminished role in his children's lives. The foundation of his world was crumbling, and in the ensuing panic and rage, something inside him snapped. That night, an argument erupted. It was the final, explosive release of years of resentment and deceit. The children were asleep upstairs, blissfully unaware of the venomous words being exchanged in the rooms below. The fight escalated, moving from the living room to the garage. It was there, surrounded by the tools of his trade and the mundane artifacts of suburban life, that Stephen's fury consumed him. He attacked Tara, his hands closing around her throat. In those final, terrifying moments, Tara Grant's life was extinguished by the man who had vowed to protect her. The silence that followed was heavy, absolute, and damning. The devout family man had become a killer. But the act of murder was only the beginning. As the adrenaline subsided, a cold, calculated clarity took its place. Stephen's mind, once consumed by rage, now turned to preservation. He could not undo what he had done, but he could try to erase it. He looked at his wife's lifeless body, and a new, more horrific plan began to form. Over the next several hours, a scene of unimaginable horror unfolded within the walls of that family home. Using the tools from his workshop, Stephen Grant, the stay-at-home father, began the methodical and gruesome task of dismembering his wife's body. It was a desperate, horrific act of concealment, an attempt to make the evidence of his crime, and Tara herself, simply disappear. On February 14, 2007, Valentine's Day, Stephen Grant walked into the Macomb County Sheriff's Office. There were no tears, just a composed and worried demeanor. He reported his wife, Tara, as a missing person. His story was practiced, precise. He told the deputies that 5 days prior, on the night of February 9th, he and Tara had argued. He claimed she had received a mysterious phone call, packed a bag, and left in an unidentified dark-colored sedan, telling him she needed to get away. He had waited, he said, hoping she would return, not wanting to cause a fuss. But now, with Valentine's Day here and no word from her, his concern had turned to fear. He was just a worried husband, desperate for his wife's safe return. The performance was initially convincing. The local media was alerted, and soon Stephen Grant's face was on television screens across Michigan. He stood before news cameras, his children sometimes by his side, and delivered emotional, tear-choked pleas for Tara to come home. "I love you," he would say, his voice cracking. "Please just call us. The kids, and I miss you so much." He spoke of their love, their family, their shared life. To the public, he was a sympathetic figure, a man crumbling under the weight of uncertainty and fear. He played the part of the grieving spouse to perfection. The detectives assigned to the case, however, are trained to look past the performance and focus on the facts. While they offered him their support, a professional skepticism began to take root. His story, while plausible on the surface, had inconsistencies. He couldn't provide any details about the car that had supposedly picked Tara up. He claimed she took her cell phone, yet records showed it hadn't been used since the night she vanished and was, in fact, turned off. His calm, almost detached demeanor during private interviews contrasted sharply with his dramatic public displays of grief. It was a subtle dissonance, a faint crack in a carefully constructed facade. The investigation widened. Police interviewed friends, family, and colleagues. A consistent portrait of Tara emerged. She was a devoted mother who would never abandon her children. The idea that she would voluntarily leave without a word, especially for so long, seemed entirely out of character. Then, a crucial piece of the puzzle fell into place. The police spoke with Verena Dirks, the au pair. Under questioning, she admitted to the affair with Stephen. She told them about the marital strife, about Tara's discovery of the betrayal, and about Tara's intention to file for divorce. Suddenly, Stephen Grant was no longer just a worried husband. He was a man with a powerful motive. The disappearance now looked less like a voluntary departure and more like a potential homicide. The investigators' focus intensified on Stephen. They began to tail him, observing his movements. They noted his frequent trips to Stony Creek Metropark, a vast expanse of woods and trails not far from his home. He would go there alone, often carrying bags or sleds, even when there was little snow on the ground. His behavior was suspicious, furtive. The pieces were coming together, forming a dark and disturbing picture. The detectives knew they needed to get inside the Grant home. On March 2nd, 2007, armed with this new information and growing suspicion, they obtained a search warrant. As investigators crossed the threshold of the Grant residence, the illusion of the happy family home immediately began to dissolve. While the main living areas were clean, almost sterile, the garage told a different story. It was Stephen's domain, the space that housed his workshop. Using luminol, a chemical that reacts with the iron in hemoglobin to reveal latent bloodstains, the forensic team sprayed the concrete floor. Under the eerie blue glow, the floor lit up. A horrifying tableau of violence was revealed, vast, invisible stains that spoke of a desperate, frantic cleanup. They found plastic bags containing blood and human tissue hidden in the workspace. In a toolbox, they found metal shavings consistent with bone being cut by a saw. The most damning discovery, however, was made not in the garage, but in the park that Stephen had frequented. Acting on their surveillance, a search team was dispatched to Stony Creek Metropark. There, in a secluded, wooded area, partially hidden under a fallen tree, they found what they were looking for. Inside a simple plastic food storage container was the torso of a woman. It was a grim, heartbreaking discovery that confirmed their worst fears. While the search of his home was underway, Stephen Grant was at his lawyer's office. He was listening to a police scanner, the crackle of the radio a soundtrack to his unraveling world. A news flash broke through the static. A woman's body had been found in Stony Creek Metropark. He knew, in that moment, that the game was over. The facade he had so carefully constructed had shattered into a million pieces. Panic set in. He borrowed a friend's pickup truck under a false pretext and fled. He drove north, with no destination in mind, just a desperate need to escape the consequences that were now racing to catch him. A massive manhunt was launched, and his face, once broadcast as a grieving husband, was now that of a wanted fugitive. For 2 days, Stephen Grant was a ghost. He abandoned the truck and fled into the snow-covered wilderness of northern Michigan. He was ill-equipped for the brutal, sub-zero temperatures. His flight was not a calculated escape, but a primal instinct to run. On the evening of March 4th, police tracked a signal from his cell phone to a remote park area. A helicopter with infrared cameras scanned the frozen landscape. They found him, curled in a fetal position under a log, shivering violently, suffering from severe hypothermia and frostbite. He was weak, disoriented, and defeated. Taken to a local hospital and treated for his exposure, the cold reality of his situation began to set in. The fight was gone. Alone in his hospital bed, under police guard, Stephen Grant began to talk. And once he started, he could not stop. In a detailed, chillingly calm, and lengthy confession, he unburdened himself of the horrific truth. The narrative he spun was one of a man pushed to his limit, but it was delivered with a cold detachment that belied the horror of his words. He recounted the argument on February 9th. He claimed Tara had belittled him, slapped him, and insulted his manhood. He described chasing her to the garage, a red haze of rage descending upon him. She was on the floor, he told the detectives, his voice steady, and I was on top of her, and I was strangling her. He spoke of the eerie silence that followed, the moment he realized his wife was dead and the children were still asleep upstairs. Then, with an almost procedural lack of emotion, he described what he did next. He moved Tara's body to the garage. He explained his thought process. He had to make her disappear. He laid her body on a plastic tarp. He used saws from his workshop. He described, in graphic detail, the process of disarticulating her remains, placing the parts into different plastic bags and containers. He recounted driving to various locations over the next few days to dispose of the evidence. Some parts were dumped in a bay, others were left in the woods at his tool and die shop, and the torso, which he had the most trouble concealing, was left in the park where it was eventually found. He admitted to the staged 911 call, the tearful media appearances, all of it a calculated performance designed to mislead everyone while he systematically tried to erase his wife from existence. The confession was a prosecutor's dream and a family's worst nightmare. It was a full admission, a step-by-step guide to his own depravity. The trial of Stephen Grant was a media sensation. The prosecution presented an overwhelming case, anchored by his own videotaped confession. The defense attempted to argue that the killing was not premeditated, a crime of passion committed in the heat of an argument, hoping for a conviction on a lesser charge of second-degree murder. They painted Stephen as a man who had been psychologically abused and emasculated by a domineering wife. The prosecution countered with a portrait of a cold, narcissistic, and calculating killer. They argued that the sheer brutality and methodical nature of the dismemberment, along with the elaborate cover-up, demonstrated a clear and conscious mind. This was not a man who had simply snapped. This was a man who, upon losing control of his wife in life, sought to exert ultimate control over her in death, obliterating her piece by piece. They pointed to his calm demeanor during his confession as evidence of his chilling lack of remorse. In December 2007, the jury delivered its verdict. They found Stephen Grant guilty of first-degree, premeditated murder. The judge, in sentencing him, called his actions a work of evil. He was sentenced to a mandatory term of 50 to 80 years in prison, ensuring that he would likely die behind bars. The story of Stephen and Tara Grant is a dark cautionary tale. It is a story about how the quiet resentments and secret betrayals that can fester in a marriage can erupt into unimaginable violence. It reveals the terrifying disconnect that can exist between a person's public image and their private reality. Stephen Grant presented himself to the world as a loving father and husband, but behind that mask was a man capable of a level of brutality that shocks the conscience. For Tara Grant, a vibrant and successful woman, her greatest threat was not a stranger in a dark alley, but the man she shared her home with. Her legacy is now carried on by her sister, who adopted her 2 children, raising them far from the shadow of their father's monstrous crime. It serves as a stark and tragic reminder that the most devastating storms often gather in the calmest-looking waters, and the deadliest betrayals are often committed by those we are supposed to trust the most. The Valentine's Day pleas were not for a lost love, but a final, desperate act in a theater of deception, masking a massacre that had already occurred. Case 2. A 7-year obsession, a story of relentless stalking that culminates in a corporate massacre. Our second story unfolds not within the confines of a family home, but in the sprawling, optimistic landscape of 1980s Silicon Valley. This was an era of boundless innovation, a place where fortunes were made and the future was being coded into existence. Within this hub of technological progress stood Electromagnetic Systems Laboratory, or ESL, a high-security defense contractor in Sunnyvale, California. It was a world of brilliant minds, government contracts, and the quiet hum of progress. In 1984, this world of logic and reason would become the stage for a 7-year descent into a purely illogical and terrifying obsession. The two central figures in this narrative could not have been more different. Laura Black was 22 years old, a bright, ambitious electrical engineer who had recently graduated from the University of California, Berkeley. She was poised, professional, and private, focused on building her career in a competitive field. She was, by all accounts, a kind person, but one who maintained a clear and healthy boundary between her professional and personal lives. Into her orbit came Richard Wade Farley. At 36, he was 14 years her senior, a software technician who had been with ESL for nearly a decade. Socially, Farley was awkward. He was known for his persistent, almost needy attempts at friendship, but was largely considered harmless by his colleagues, an odd but non-threatening fixture in the corporate landscape. He had never been in a serious long-term relationship. His inner world was one of fantasy and deep-seated insecurity, a world in which he was the hero of a story no one else was reading. In the spring of 1984, Laura Black was assigned to a project that required her to interact with Farley. For Laura, it was a routine professional engagement. For Richard Farley, it was a moment of profound, life-altering significance. He became instantly and completely infatuated. In his mind, Laura Black was not just an attractive colleague. She was the solution to his loneliness, the missing piece of his life, the woman he was destined to be with. Within weeks of their first meeting, he asked her out. Laura, who felt no romantic connection to him, politely but firmly declined. For a rational mind, this would have been the end of the matter. A simple, unambiguous no. But Richard Farley's mind was not rational. He interpreted her rejection not as a final answer, but as a challenge, a test of his devotion. Her no was simply a try harder. And so began what Farley would later describe as his courtship, and what Laura Black and the rest of the world would recognize as a relentless campaign of psychological terror. The harassment started subtly with actions that, in isolation, might seem innocuous if a bit strange. He began baking for her, leaving loaves of bread and cakes on her desk. He would send messages to her computer terminal through the company's internal system, VMS, an endless stream of non-work-related chatter. He tracked her movements, learning her schedule with an unnerving precision. He discovered she was a member of a local aerobics class. He promptly joined the same one, positioning himself where he could watch her throughout the workout. When he learned the make and model of her car, he would scour the ESL parking lot each morning until he found it, then park as close as he possibly could. Laura's discomfort grew into a constant, low-grade anxiety. She felt watched, monitored. Her workspace, once a place of professional focus, now felt like a cage with her observer always nearby. She tried to handle it herself, repeatedly telling Farley to leave her alone. Her requests were polite but firm, yet they had no effect. It was as if he couldn't hear her. He saw her pleas for distance as a form of playful banter, part of the romantic game he was playing inside his head. The situation escalated. Farley obtained her home address and other personal information from a confidential employee database within ESL, a gross violation of company policy. He began to photograph company events, focusing almost exclusively on Laura. He even joined the company's softball team simply because he believed Laura might attend the games. Every aspect of his life was now being reconfigured to revolve around a woman who wanted nothing to do with him. Laura Black, along with several concerned colleagues, finally went to ESL's Human Resources Department. They documented the incessant harassment, the unwanted gifts, the stalking behavior. Over the next 2 years, ESL's management and HR department formally warned Richard Farley 4 times. He was ordered to stop contacting Laura, to cease his non-work-related messaging, and to attend psychological counseling sessions provided by the company. Farley would agree to the terms, attend a few sessions, and then, within weeks, his behavior would resume. He was a master of feigned compliance. He told counselors what they wanted to hear, all the while his obsession continued to metastasize in the dark. For 2 years, ESL tried to manage the problem internally, caught between their legal obligation to provide a safe workplace and their reluctance to fire a long-term employee. The breaking point came in the autumn of 1986. Farley had violated the terms of his behavioral contract one too many times. His performance was suffering, and his harassment of Laura, though more covert, had not stopped. In October, ESL terminated his employment. After nearly 10 years with the company, Richard Farley was fired. In his mind, there was only one person to blame: Laura Black. He had lost his job, his income, and his only legitimate means of being near her, all because she would not accept his love. The termination did not extinguish his obsession. It poured gasoline on it. Now, stripped of his professional identity and cut off from his target, his fixation twisted into something far more sinister. It was no longer just about winning her over. It was about possession, and if he couldn't possess her, he would exact revenge for the rejection that had, in his view, ruined his life. The stalking, now unconstrained by workplace rules, intensified to a terrifying degree. He began a letter-writing campaign, sending hundreds of pages to both her home and her office at ESL. The letters were a chilling window into his delusional mind. They were a bizarre mix of feigned apologies, romantic ramblings, declarations of undying love, and veiled threats. He wrote as if they were in a long-standing, troubled relationship, as if her refusals were merely a lover's quarrel that could be patched up. He detailed his fantasies of them getting married and having a family. He also made it clear that he would never, ever give up. His physical presence was a constant threat. He began parking his car outside the ESL building for hours at a time, watching the employees come and go, hoping for a glimpse of her. He joined her new fitness club. He even took a class at a local university, not to learn, but because he saw her car in the parking lot and assumed she was a student there. Laura Black's world shrank. She lived in a state of perpetual fear, constantly looking over her shoulder. She varied her routes to and from work. She stopped going to the gym. She felt like a prisoner in her own life, her every move dictated by the specter of Richard Farley. As his obsession deepened, so did his preparation for violence. Having lost his high-paying job at ESL, Farley struggled to find comparable work. His financial situation deteriorated rapidly. He was losing everything. As his old life crumbled, he began building a new identity, that of an aggrieved warrior. He began to assemble a massive arsenal. He bought a Benelli riot shotgun, a Ruger M77 rifle with a scope and several pistols. He acquired a pump-action shotgun, an Uzi-style semi-automatic rifle, and thousands of rounds of ammunition. He bought a smoke bomb, a gas mask, and a tactical vest. This was not a sudden impulse. It was a slow, methodical, and deliberate preparation for war. By late 1987, Farley was on the brink of complete financial collapse. His house was entering foreclosure. He blamed it all on ESL and, by extension, on Laura. The rejection had cost him his job, his home, his entire life. The final straw for Laura came when she discovered that Farley had managed to get a copy of her house key from her landlord by posing as her husband. The violation was absolute. She now knew he could enter her home at will. The fear was no longer about being watched from a distance. It was about the imminent threat of him crossing her threshold. In a state of terror, she finally turned to the legal system. She documented the years of harassment, the letters, the stalking, the unwanted encounters, and filed for a temporary restraining order against Richard Farley. It was granted on February 2nd, 1988. A court date was set for February 17th, 1988, to determine if a permanent, 3-year restraining order should be issued. To Farley, this was the ultimate betrayal. He had offered her his love, his devotion, his entire being, and in return, she was using the law to keep him away. The court date of February 17th became his deadline. In a letter he mailed to his own attorney, to be opened in the event of his death, he laid out his chilling logic. He felt that the restraining order would ruin his life forever. He wrote, "This is it. Nothing is going to get better. ESL and she have taken an enjoyable life and turned it into a nightmare." He felt he had to handle the situation before that court date. He believed that if he could just get Laura to talk to him, to sit down with him, she would finally understand the depth of his feelings. He would make her listen. On Tuesday, February 16th, 1988, the day before the court hearing, Richard Farley put his plan into motion. He loaded his collection of 7 firearms and over 1,000 rounds of ammunition into his brown motorhome. He packed his vest with ammo clips, donned a gas mask, and put on ear protectors. He was dressed for combat. He drove the motorhome, a lumbering vehicle of war, to the ESL campus in Sunnyvale. It was just before 3 p.m., the end of the workday. He parked and got out. His first victim was 46-year-old Lawrence Kane, an engineer he knew from his time at the company, who was walking across the parking lot. Farley raised his shotgun and shot him in the chest, killing him instantly. He then walked to the side of the main ESL building, a large, 2-story structure known as Building M5. The building was protected by a key-card security system. Farley raised a shotgun and blasted the glass out of a locked door, shattering it. He stepped through the jagged frame and entered the building. The sound of the shotgun blast echoed through the halls, a percussive announcement of the horror to come. At first, employees thought it was a prank or perhaps construction noise. The confusion quickly turned to terror as Farley began to move through the building. He was methodical. He was calm. He walked down a first-floor hallway, firing his shotgun at office doors and computer equipment. He shot and killed 27-year-old Wayne Buddy Williams Jr. and injured several others who were caught in his path. He was not shooting randomly. He was moving with a purpose. He was looking for Laura. He made his way to the stairwell, heading for the 2nd floor, where Laura Black's office was located. Employees scrambled for cover, hiding under desks and closets, barricading themselves in offices. The air was filled with the smell of gunpowder and the screams of the terrified. Farley reached the 2nd floor and continued his rampage. He shot and killed Ronald Doney, 36, and Harry Miller, 49. He moved through the cubicles, a hunter in his own former workplace, his weapons creating a symphony of destruction. Then he found her. Laura Black was in her cubicle. She heard the commotion and looked up to see Richard Farley, armed and armored, walking towards her. There was no time to run, no time to hide. He raised a shotgun. For 7 years, he had tried to get closer to her, and now he stood just feet away, the instrument of her death in his hands. He fired. The blast struck her in the left shoulder, the force of it throwing her back against her desk. She collapsed to the floor, grievously wounded, bleeding profusely. Believing he had killed her, Farley turned and continued his march through the building, searching for other targets he had on his mental list: managers and HR personnel he believed had wronged him. Within minutes of the first shots, 911 calls flooded the Sunnyvale Department of Public Safety. Police and SWAT teams swarmed the ESL campus, surrounding Building M5. A siege began. Farley had killed 4 people and wounded many more, but he was now trapped inside with dozens of terrified hostages. For the next 5 hours, a tense standoff unfolded. Farley engaged with police negotiators over the phone. His demeanor was bizarrely calm, almost casual. He complained about his financial problems, about how ESL had fired him, about how Laura had refused him. He still seemed to believe that his actions were a justifiable response to his perceived mistreatment. At one point, he told a negotiator, "I'm not a bad guy, I just got pushed a little too far." He demanded a sandwich and a soda. His primary demand, however, was to speak with Laura Black. He was unaware that she was alive, having been rescued by a brave colleague and carried out of the building to waiting paramedics. The SWAT team, meanwhile, was methodically clearing the building, evacuating small groups of employees who had been hiding. They knew Farley was contained in a specific area, still armed and dangerous. The negotiators played along with his delusion, telling him they were trying to arrange a conversation with Laura, using it as a tactic to keep him on the phone and to prevent him from harming anyone else. As the hours dragged on, and with the SWAT team preparing for a tactical assault, Farley's resolve began to weaken. The adrenaline was wearing off, replaced by the grim reality of his situation. He was out of food, tired, and he had accomplished his mission of terror. Shortly after 8 p.m., after one final conversation with a negotiator, Richard Farley laid down his weapons and surrendered. He walked out of the building, his hands in the air, and was taken into custody. The final toll of his rampage was staggering. He had murdered 7 people: Lawrence Kane, Wayne Williams Jr., Ronald Doney, Harry Miller, Joseph Silva, Glenda Moritz, and Richard Townsley. He had wounded 4 others, including Laura Black. He had terrorized an entire company and community. Laura Black survived. The shotgun blast had shattered her shoulder and left her with permanent injuries. She would endure years of surgeries and physical therapy. The psychological scars, she would later say, were even more profound. Richard Farley's trial began in 1991. His defense team argued that he never intended to kill anyone. They claimed he was a victim of obsession, that his plan was to get Laura's attention and then commit suicide by cop. The prosecution methodically dismantled this defense. They presented Farley's hundreds of letters, the testimony of his terrified colleagues, and the evidence of his extensive weapon purchases as proof of a long-term, calculated plan for mass murder. The letter he had sent to his attorney, outlining his intent to handle the situation, was the final nail in the coffin. The jury found him guilty of 7 counts of first-degree murder and numerous other felonies. He was sentenced to death. To this day, Richard Wade Farley resides on death row at San Quentin State Prison, an old man whose life has been defined by a single afternoon of horrific violence born from years of unrequited obsession. The ESL shooting was a watershed moment. In its aftermath, the nation began to confront the real and lethal danger of stalking. Laura Black's horrific ordeal and her brave testimony became a catalyst for change. In 1990, California passed the first anti-stalking law in the United States, making it a specific crime to willfully and repeatedly follow or harass another person and make a credible threat against them. In the years that followed, every other state would pass similar legislation. It is a legacy forged in blood and terror, a stark testament to the fact that the refusal of a single date can, in the mind of a predator, be twisted into a justification for a massacre. It is a chilling reminder that obsession is not a form of love, but a form of violence waiting for a trigger. Case 3. The Workshop of Horrors. A husband's brutal betrayal unfolds after a staged disappearance. For our third case, we travel to the humid, moss-draped landscape of Tallahassee, Florida. It is a region where civilization and untamed wilderness exist in a fragile proximity, where sprawling lakes and dense swampland hold secrets as old as time itself. Here, life often revolves around the outdoors. Hunting, fishing, and boating are not just hobbies, but a deeply ingrained part of the local culture. It was against this backdrop of natural beauty and rugged tradition that a story of profound betrayal, breathtaking greed, and the unwavering resolve of a mother's love would unfold over the course of nearly 2 decades. Mike Williams was, by all accounts, a man living a life many would envy. At 31 years old in the year 2000, he was a successful and respected real estate appraiser, a hard worker known for his easygoing nature, his infectious smile, and his devotion to his family. He was an avid outdoorsman, most at home in a boat with a fishing rod or a shotgun in his hands. He was married to his high school sweetheart, Denise Merrill Williams. They had met as teenagers at North Florida Christian School, a place where their shared faith and values took root. Their life together seemed idyllic. They had a young daughter, who was just 18 months old, and had recently celebrated the purchase of a new home. At the center of their social circle was another man, Brian Winchester. Brian was not just a friend. He was Mike's best friend, his confidant, his hunting partner. They had known each other since they were boys. Brian worked in insurance, and it was Brian who had sold Mike his life insurance policies, a routine act of financial planning between trusted friends. The bond between the two men appeared unshakable, a brotherhood forged over years of shared experiences in the classrooms, football fields, and murky waters of northern Florida. Denise, Mike, and Brian formed a tight-knit trio. They socialized together, vacationed together, and supported each other. To any outside observer, it was a picture of perfect, small-town friendship. December 16th, 2000, was a day of celebration. It was Mike and Denise's 6th wedding anniversary. True to his character, Mike planned to start the day doing what he loved. Before the sun rose, he hitched his boat to his truck, gathered his gear, and set off for Lake Seminole, a massive reservoir straddling the Florida-Georgia border, famous for its excellent duck hunting. He told Denise he would be back by noon, in time for them to celebrate their anniversary properly. It was a promise he would never keep. When noon came and went with no word from Mike, Denise began to make calls. She called his father, who immediately drove to the lake to begin searching. The afternoon sun began to dip towards the horizon, and a quiet concern morphed into a palpable sense of dread. By late afternoon, a full-scale search was underway, involving law enforcement and volunteers from 3 counties. The vast, murky expanse of Lake Seminole was scoured by boats and helicopters. They found Mike's Ford Bronco parked at a remote boat ramp in Jackson County. Later that night, searchers located his boat, adrift in the middle of a large cove. The boat was empty. Inside, they found a shotgun, but Mike was gone. The discovery sent a chill through the search party. The next morning, a searcher found Mike's hunting jacket floating in the water, along with his hunting license. But of Mike Williams himself, there was no trace. In the face of this baffling disappearance, a terrifying theory quickly took hold, one that seemed both sensational and grimly plausible. Lake Seminole is infamous for its massive population of alligators. The working hypothesis, adopted by investigators and amplified by local media, was that Mike had fallen out of his boat into the cold December water. Weighed down by his heavy insulated waders, he would have struggled to stay afloat and, in his vulnerable state, had been attacked and consumed by alligators. It was a gruesome, horrific scenario, but one that seemed to explain the complete absence of a body. Brian Winchester, the best friend, was on the scene, seemingly distraught, helping to coordinate the search. He helped propagate the alligator theory, telling searchers and family members that it was the only logical explanation. Weeks later, a pair of waders, believed to be Mike's, were found in the search area. A fishing hat was also recovered. The official investigation concluded that Mike Williams had accidentally fallen from his boat and drowned, his body subsequently devoured by wildlife. The case was closed. Accidental death. For most, this was a tragic but acceptable conclusion. A terrible accident had befallen a good man. The community mourned. Denise Williams was now a grieving widow, left to raise her young daughter alone. But there was one person who refused to accept this narrative: Mike's mother, Cheryl Williams. Cheryl was a woman of quiet strength and fierce intuition. From the very beginning, the alligator story felt wrong to her. She was a mother who knew her son. Mike was an expert hunter and boater, cautious and experienced. He knew Lake Seminole like the back of his hand. It seemed inconceivable to her that he would simply fall out of his boat. Furthermore, she researched alligator behavior. She learned that alligators do not typically feed in the cold water of December. Even if they did, they are known to be messy eaters, and it was highly unlikely that they would have consumed an entire man-water's bones, and all without leaving a single trace of blood or tissue behind. The boat was found undisturbed. His shotgun was still inside. Nothing about the scene suggested a violent struggle with a large predator. Cheryl's doubt hardened into a certainty. Her son had not died in an accident. He had been murdered. And so began a lonely, 17-year crusade for the truth. She became a relentless investigator, a grieving mother transformed into a cold case detective. She wrote thousands of letters to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, to the governor's office, to any official who would listen, begging them to reopen her son's case. She took out full-page ads in the local newspaper, pleading with anyone who had information to come forward. The ads ran on Mike's birthday and on the anniversary of his disappearance, year after year, a public and painful reminder that she would not give up. She was dismissed by many as a heartbroken mother unable to accept a tragic accident. But she was unyielding. She knew, with a certainty that defied official reports, that there was a darker story hidden beneath the waters of Lake Seminole. While Cheryl fought her lonely battle, life moved on for Denise Williams and Brian Winchester. 6 months after Mike vanished, Denise cashed in on his life insurance policies. The total payout was nearly $2 million. The agent who had sold Mike the largest of these policies, a $1.5 million policy written just months before his disappearance, was his best friend, Brian Winchester. The transaction, once seen as a sign of their close friendship, now looked, in the rearview mirror of tragedy, deeply suspicious to Cheryl. For 5 years, Denise and Brian maintained the appearance of a grieving widow and a supportive friend. But in 2005, they married. They moved into a new home together, raising Mike's daughter as their own. To the community, it might have seemed like two people finding solace in each other after a shared tragedy. To Cheryl Williams, it was the confirmation of her deepest fears. The best friend had married the widow and was now living a life financed by her son's death. The picture was now hideously clear in her mind. Her son had been eliminated so that his wife and his best friend could be together and inherit his fortune. Still, she had no proof. For more than a decade, the case remained cold. Denise and Brian were, By all outward appearances, a normal, affluent family. Cheryl's pleas for an investigation were met with polite dismissals. There was no body, no crime scene, no evidence of foul play. There was only the unwavering conviction of a mother. The break in the case came not from a brilliant piece of detective work or a deathbed confession, but from the implosion of the very relationship that had been built on a foundation of murder. By 2016, the marriage between Denise and Brian Winchester had deteriorated. It was a union born of a dark secret, and over the years, the weight of that secret had poisoned everything. Denise filed for divorce, seeking to end the relationship. For Brian Winchester, this was an existential threat. He was a man who had killed to get what he wanted, and now he was facing the loss of it all. He was terrified that Denise, in the heat of an acrimonious divorce, would expose their secret to save herself or to gain an advantage in the settlement. His paranoia and rage boiled over. On August 5, 2016, he hid in the back of Denise's SUV, waiting for her. When she got in to drive to work, he held her at gunpoint, his face covered. He began to talk about their shared secret about the past. Denise, a woman who had her own deep reservoirs of composure, managed to talk him down. She promised him they could work things out, that she wouldn't tell anyone. She convinced him to let her go. As soon as she was safe, she drove straight to the police. Brian Winchester was arrested and charged with the armed kidnapping of his wife. He was facing the possibility of life in prison. The perfect life he had killed for was in ruins. He was cornered, desperate, and he had only one card left to play: the truth about Mike Williams. In 2017, with a life sentence for kidnapping looming over him, Winchester's attorney approached the state prosecutor's office. He offered a deal. In exchange for full immunity from prosecution in the murder of Mike Williams, Brian Winchester would tell them everything. He would confess to the crime and, most importantly, he would lead them to the body. For investigators, it was a devil's bargain, but it was the only path to finally solving the 16-year-old mystery and providing a measure of justice for the Williams family. The state agreed. The confession that followed was a masterpiece of cold-blooded horror, delivered with the calm detachment of a man recounting a business transaction. Winchester laid out the entire conspiracy. He and Denise had been having an affair for 3 years before Mike's death. They wanted to be together, but they didn't want the social stigma or the financial cost of a divorce. Mike, Brian explained, was an obstacle. So they decided to remove him. They planned the murder for months, discussing ways to make it look like an accident. The anniversary hunting trip was the perfect cover. Brian described how he met Mike at a remote spot on Lake Seminole. They launched their boats and went out to a secluded area to hunt. At the opportune moment, Brian told Mike to stand up and look at something to distract him, and then he pushed him out of the boat. The plan was for Mike, weighed down by his waders, to simply drown. But the plan went wrong. Mike was a strong man. He didn't panic. He managed to grab onto a submerged tree stump and pull his head above water. He was struggling, gasping for air, but he was not drowning. Brian Winchester circled him in his boat, watching his best friend fight for his life. In that moment, Brian realized the plan had failed. He retrieved his 12-gauge shotgun from his boat, circled around to face Mike, and, as Mike pleaded for help, Brian Winchester shot his best friend directly in the face at close range. The rest of his confession was a chilling exercise in logistics. He heaved Mike's body into his boat, then transferred it to his Chevy Suburban at the boat ramp. He drove back to his father's house, washed the boat, and then drove Mike's Bronco back to the lake to leave it at the ramp, creating the illusion that Mike had driven there alone. He then drove Mike's body to a remote, swampy area near Carr Lake in Leon County, a place he knew well from his childhood. He dug a deep hole in the muck, rolled his friend's body into it, and covered him with dirt and branches. He had chosen the spot carefully, knowing it was unlikely to ever be developed or disturbed. He then rejoined the search party, feigning grief and shock, guiding them with the false alligator narrative he and Denise had concocted. As part of his immunity deal, Brian Winchester led investigators to that exact spot. On December 21st, 2017, nearly 17 years to the day after Mike Williams disappeared, forensic teams began to dig. Buried more than 5 feet deep in the mud, they found human remains. Dental records and DNA confirmed they belonged to Michael Williams. An examination of the skull showed catastrophic damage consistent with a shotgun blast to the head. Cheryl Williams finally had her proof. Her son was coming home. In May 2018, a grand jury indicted Denise Williams on charges of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and accessory after the fact. Her trial began in December 2018. The prosecution's star witness was her former lover and co-conspirator, Brian Winchester. On the stand, he recounted the entire sordid tale of the affair, the insurance fraud, the meticulous planning, and the brutal execution of the murder. He painted Denise not as a passive participant, but as the cold, calculating mind who helped plot every detail. Denise's defense team portrayed Winchester as a manipulative monster and a liar, a man who would say anything to save himself from a life sentence for kidnapping. They argued that he had acted alone, obsessed with Denise, and had fabricated her involvement to secure his immunity deal. The jury did not believe them. They listened to Winchester's chillingly detailed confession, corroborated by the location of the body and the forensic evidence. They heard about the insurance policies. They saw the timeline of the affair and the subsequent marriage. After 8 hours of deliberation, they found Denise Williams guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. The case of Mike Williams is a chilling saga of betrayal in its most absolute form. It was a murder disguised as a hunting accident, a cover-up that lasted for half a generation, and a conspiracy that was only exposed by the implosion of the conspirators' own greed-fueled relationship. It stands as a testament to the corrosive power of secrets and the terrifying reality that the greatest danger can come from those held closest. But above all, it is the story of a mother's love, a stubborn, unyielding force that refused to let her son be forgotten, a quiet voice that insisted on the truth until, after 17 long years, the world was finally forced to listen. Case 4. The Murderous Couple's Spree. A sadistic duo's twisted bond leads to a reign of terror. For our final story, we step back in time to the heart of 1950s America. It was the era of Eisenhower, of burgeoning suburbs of sock hops and burgeoning rock and roll. It was a time of perceived innocence and rigid social conformity, a black and white world projected in the warm glow of the television set. But beneath this placid surface, in the frozen plains of Lincoln, Nebraska, a different kind of story was brewing, a story not of innocence, but of a profound and violent nihilism. It is a story of how a twisted, adolescent love became the catalyst for one of the most infamous killing sprees in American history, a rampage that would forever scar the nation's psyche and leave a question that lingers to this day. At the heart of this storm was Charles "Charlie" Starkweather. At 19 years old in 1957, he was a portrait of disenfranchisement. Small in stature, with fiery red hair and bow legs, he was plagued by a speech impediment that had made him a target for bullies throughout his childhood. He saw the world from the bottom looking up. Dropping out of high school, he worked a menial job as a garbage collector, a role that only reinforced his deep-seated feelings of worthlessness and rage. He found his idol not in the heroes of the era, but in the brooding, rebellious figure of James Dean. He slicked back his hair, wore a leather jacket and blue jeans, and adopted a defiant postura walking caricature of the rebel without a cause. But where Dean's rebellion was an act for the screen, Charlie's was a simmering, deadly reality. He was a powder keg of resentment, waiting for a spark. That spark came in the form of a 14-year-old girl named Carol and Fugate. Charlie was friends with her older sister's husband and first met Carol when she was just 13. To him, she was not a child. She was an object of intense fascination, a blank canvas onto which he could project his fantasies of power and adoration. To Carol, a quiet girl from a working-class family, the 19-year-old Charlie was a figure of excitement. He was older, he had a car, and he represented an escape from the predictable rhythm of her adolescent life in Lincoln. He taught her to drive in his souped-up 1949 Ford, a taste of freedom that was both thrilling and dangerous. Their relationship quickly deepened into a strange, intense bond, much to the alarm of Carol's family. Her mother, Velda Bartlett, and her stepfather, Marion Bartlett, deeply disapproved of Charlie. They saw him for what he was, a volatile, jobless troublemaker with no future. They forbade Carol from seeing him, a command that, in Charlie's mind, was not a parental concern but a declaration of war. Their disapproval was a direct challenge to his fragile ego, an insult he could not abide. The family that stood between him and the girl he considered his property became the focal point of his simmering rage. Before he turned that rage on the Bartletts, Charlie had already crossed the ultimate line. In the early morning hours of December 1st, 1957, he attempted to buy a stuffed animal for Carol on credit at a gas station. The attendant, 21-year-old Robert Calvert, refused. For Charlie, this simple refusal was another unbearable slight. He returned later with a shotgun, robbed the station of $100, and forced Calvert into his car. He drove him to a deserted country road. There, stripped of his power, Calvert begged for his life. Charlie Starkweather shot him in the head. It was his first kill. The experience was not traumatic, it was empowering. He had discovered that murder was the ultimate expression of control, the ultimate solution for anyone who stood in his way. He had tasted blood, and he found that he liked it. The final confrontation with Carol's family was now inevitable. On January 21st, 1958, nearly 2 months after killing Robert Calvert, Charlie drove to the Bartlett home. He was no longer welcome there. An argument erupted. The precise sequence of events would be debated for decades, shrouded in the conflicting testimonies of the two people who survived. But the outcome was one of absolute carnage. In a fit of rage, Charlie shot and killed Carol's stepfather, Marion Bartlett, with his .22 rifle. He then turned on her mother, Velda, bludgeoning and stabbing her to death with a hunting knife. But the horror was not over. In another room of the small house was Carol's 2.5-year-old half-sister, Betty Jean. She was a witness. A loose end. Charlie killed the toddler. The details are monstrous. He either bludgeoned her or stabbed her or both. In the space of a few brutal minutes, an entire family had been annihilated. What followed was perhaps the most psychologically disturbing chapter of the entire saga. Instead of fleeing, Charlie Starkweather and Carol and Fugate remained in the house. For 6 days, they lived there, surrounded by the bodies of Carol's slain family, which they had hidden in outbuildings and wrapped in newspaper. They ate food from the kitchen, they watched television, they slept in the beds. They placed a carefully lettered sign on the front door, written in Carol's hand. "Stay away. Everybody is sick with the flu." It was a chilling display of detachment, a descent into a shared, private world where the normal rules of reality no longer applied. They were now bound by a terrible secret, a folie à deux shared madness. They were no longer Charlie and Carol, They were outlaws, united against a world they had violently rejected. This macabre domesticity could not last. On January 27th, Carol's grandmother grew deeply suspicious and threatened to call the police. The fantasy was over. Charlie and Carol loaded his rifle and fled the house, leaving behind this silent testament to their crimes. They were now fugitives, with nothing to lose and a full tank of gas. The killing spree began in earnest. Their first stop was the farm of August Meyer, a 70-year-old family friend who lived in the rural community of Bennett, Nebraska. They knew him. They knew he lived alone and likely had cash. Charlie shot him in the head with the shotgun he'd brought along, then bludgeoned him with the butt of the rifle. The killing was now casual, almost transactional. They took some money and fled, leaving Meyer's body in a shed. From there, they headed back towards Lincoln, their path intersecting with two other young people whose lives were about to be extinguished by pure chance. Robert Jensen, a 17-year-old high school student, and his 16-year-old girlfriend, Carol King, were driving in Jensen's car when Charlie and Carol flagged them down, pretending their own car had broken down. Once inside, Charlie pulled his gun. He forced Jensen to drive them to an abandoned storm cellar in a desolate field. He ordered Jensen out of the car. He shot him 6 times in the back of the head. He then turned his attention to Carol King. He took her back to the cellar. What happened next is a matter of some dispute, but the outcome was one of unspeakable brutality. After a struggle, Charlie shot her in the head. Not satisfied that she was dead, he then stabbed her repeatedly, post-mortem. The bodies of the 2 teenagers were left in the cold, dark cellar, a monument to the couple's escalating sadism. The love story, such as it was now written in the blood of their peers. Now driving Jensen's stolen car, they needed a new refuge. They drove to one of Lincoln's wealthiest neighborhoods, selecting a large, handsome brick house at random. It was the home of C. Lauer Ward, a prominent industrialist, and his wife, Clara. They broke in and found Clara Ward and her 51-year-old maid, Lillian Fenkel. Charlie tied them up. He stabbed the maid to death with a bayonet. He then stabbed Clara Ward. He waited. When Lauer Ward returned home from work that evening, Charlie met him at the door and shot him, killing him instantly. For the second time, the couple took up residence in a house of the dead. They ate food from the refrigerator. Charlie tried on Lauer Ward's clothes, and they slept in the master bedroom. They were living out a perverse fantasy of wealth and power, a life they felt they were owed, paid for with the lives of the home's rightful owners. The next morning, January 29th, they loaded up the Ward's pristine 1956 black Packard with stolen jewelry and supplies, and they fled west, leaving a city in the grip of terror. The entire state was now on high alert. The National Guard had been called out. A massive manhunt was underway for the red-haired killer and his teenage girlfriend. Their faces were on every television and in every newspaper. Driving the stolen, and now highly conspicuous, Packard, they knew they needed another vehicle. Just outside the town of Douglas, Wyoming, they spotted a 1957 Buick parked on the shoulder of the highway. Inside, a 37-year-old shoe salesman named Merle Collison was asleep in the front seat, taking a nap on a long business trip. Charlie approached the car and tapped on the window. When Collison awoke, startled, Charlie fired his shotgun through the glass, hitting him 9 times. It was a senseless, brutal, and panicked murder. But the act drew the attention of a passing motorist who saw the struggle and flagged down a police officer. The chase was on. Natrona County Sheriff's Deputy William Romer pursued the Packard at high speeds. Charlie, driving recklessly, lost control. As the police car closed in, Charlie fired a shot out the back window. The deputy returned fire. A bullet shattered the Packard's rear window, and a shard of flying glass struck Charlie on the neck, drawing blood. In his panic, he thought he had been seriously wounded. He slammed on the brakes, jumped out of the car, and surrendered. His reign of terror, which had lasted just 8 days and claimed 11 lives, including Carol's family, was over. In the confusion, Carol and Fugate ran from the car, not to Charlie, but towards the police officer, screaming. Her story poured out. She was a hostage, a terrified victim who had been kidnapped after Charlie murdered her family. She claimed she had been in fear for her life the entire time, forced to go along with his murderous rampage. 2 trials followed, and 2 very different narratives emerged. Charlie Starkweather, at his trial in Nebraska, was initially protective of Carol. But as his own fate became sealed, he changed his story. He became boastful, arrogant, reveling in the media attention. He painted Carol not as a hostage, but as a cold-blooded and willing participant, the most trigger-happy person he had ever known. He claimed she had personally killed some of the victims. His performance did him no favors. He was convicted of the murder of Robert Jensen and sentenced to death. On June 25, 1959, at the age of 20, Charles Starkweather was executed in the electric chair at the Nebraska State Penitentiary. His final words were reportedly, "What's in it for me?" Carol and Fugate's trial was a national sensation. At just 15 years old, she was the youngest female in United States history to be tried for first-degree murder. Her defense clung to the hostage narrative. They portrayed her as a child, paralyzed by fear, under the complete psychological control of a charismatic psychopath who had murdered her entire family before her eyes. How could she have been expected to resist or escape? The prosecution painted a different picture. They pointed to the numerous opportunities she had to flee. Why didn't she run when Charlie was robbing August Meyer? Why didn't she escape when they stopped for gas? Why did she help reload the guns? And most damningly, why did she write the note for the front door, telling the world her family was sick with the flu when she knew they were dead? They argued she was a cunning and willing accomplice, a partner in crime. The jury was swayed by the prosecution. They convicted Carol and Fugate of first-degree murder. Due to her age, she was spared the death penalty and sentenced to life in prison. She served 17.5 years before being paroled in 1976, a model prisoner. Upon her release, she changed her name, moved to Michigan, and vanished into a quiet, anonymous life, forever refusing to speak publicly about the events of that terrible week. The case of Starkweather and Fugate left an indelible scar on the American landscape, inspiring books, songs, and films, including Terrence Malick's Badlands and Oliver Stone's Natural-Born Killers. It shattered the illusion of 1950s innocence, revealing a capacity for motiveless, nihilistic violence that the country was not prepared to confront. But at its core, it leaves behind a chilling, unanswered question. Was Carol and Fugate a captive or a killer? Was she a terrified child, a victim of a circumstance so horrific it is beyond our comprehension? Or was she a knowing and active participant, her youthful face masking a heart as cold as her lover's? It is a question that died with Charles Starkweather in the electric chair and lives on in the silence of the woman who survived. Theirs was not a romance. It was a shared psychosis, a deadly pact that played out across the frozen heartland, a Valentine's Day massacre not of a single day, but of an entire era's innocence. The piano music slowly, gently, fades to silence. Narrator. Tonight, we have journeyed through 4 corridors of darkness, each one leading from a place of intimacy to a scene of ultimate betrayal. We saw how a husband's resentment, masked by devotion, could lead to a gruesome act of erasure. We witnessed a 7-year obsession culminate in a calculated massacre, all for a love that never existed. We uncovered a conspiracy of greed between a wife and a best friend that lay hidden for 17 years beneath a placid lake. And finally, we revisited a twisted teenage romance that became a byword for senseless violence. These stories remind us that the most profound horrors are not always born of monstrous strangers, but can fester in the familiar soil of our own lives, in the quiet desperation of a failing marriage, in the unrequited gaze of a colleague, in the bonds of friendship, and in the fever of a first love. They are born from love's corruption, when passion sours into possession and rejection becomes a justification for ruin. May the stories of these victims serve not as simple entertainment, but as a somber reflection on the fragility of life and the darkness that can hide behind a familiar face. Thank you for joining us at the Crime Folio. Sleep well if you can.